Welcome, everyone. My name is Rachel Massey, and I'm the Senior Science and Policy Advisor with TAE, the Collaborative for Health and Environment. We're really pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on scientific integrity and how we can best work together to protect independent science and scientists. We're bringing you this webinar in partnership with the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment's Science Action Network. Please feel free to put a note in the chat introducing yourself if you'd like to. And we look forward to your comments and questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A box at any point, and we'll get to as many as we can after the presentations. If you're joining us by phone, you can download some of today's slides from the webinar page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. And we've got additional slides that we'll add right after the presentation. For those who are online, we'll put that link in the chat in just a couple minutes. If you'd like to activate closed captions, you can do that by clicking the button on the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and it's scheduled to last for an hour and a quarter. Our colleagues at the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment would like to point you to UCSF's Chemical Industry Documents Library, which pre-stewards. It's an archive of documents from the chemical industry, and it's part of the larger UCSF Industry Documents Library. That's a publicly accessible resource, and we're going to put a link into the chat for that as well, both for the Science Action Network and for the Documents Library. So we have a wonderful and very distinguished group of speakers joining us today, and I'm honored to start by introducing Dr. Tyrone Hayes. Dr. Hayes is a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at UC Berkeley. His research focuses on the role of steroid hormones in amphibian development, and he conducts both laboratory and field studies in the US and Africa. His work synthesizes ecological, evolutionary, organismal, physiological, and biochemical molecular studies to learn how an animal translates change in its external environment to internal changes, and how changes at the molecular level affect an animal's ability to adapt to changes in its external environment. I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with his research on hormone disrupting chemicals in amphibians, and in particular with his research concluding that the herbicide atrazine is an endocrine disruptor that demasculinizes and feminizes male frogs. Dr. Hayes was elected to the National Academy of Sciences this year, a much deserved honor in recognition of distinguished and continuing achievements in original research. So I'd like to invite Dr. Hayes to start the conversation now, and he will also be moderating the discussion and questions and answers at the end. Dr. Hayes.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to my colleagues, David and Stacy, for joining me here. And also I want to thank all the participants who are joining us here today. If I can just share my screen. Just this, okay. Does everybody see a frog? Thumbs up?
See a frog. Yep.
Okay, good. Sometimes you never know with Zoom. So I am primarily a developmental endocrinologist. I've been on the faculty and been doing research at the University of California, Berkeley for a little over 30 years now. My interest is mainly in developmental endocrinology of amphibians, and specifically, I'm interested in how hormones regulate reproductive development and function, reproductive function in amphibians. I got involved with some industry research when Novartis, who then became Syngenta, asked me to use frogs as a model to try to understand whether or not the herbicide atrazine, at the time the largest selling agrochemical in the world, to figure out if atrazine was an endocrine disruptor. Just in brief, we discovered that atrazine caused genetically male frogs to develop a combination, in some cases, of ovaries and testes. So they became hermaphrodites. Some of those animals completely, even though they're genetic males, completely turn into females. So this figure shows a genetically male frog laying viable eggs. In fact, we're studying the great-great-great-grandchildren of those eggs right now in the lab. So we've been doing research for multiple generations. We proposed at the time that instead of making testosterone, these males were induced to convert their testosterone into estrogen. The result being that the male hormone testosterone disappears and you lose masculine features, and the female hormone estrogen is produced and you gain female typical characteristics. This is associated with a decrease in fertility in males. So typically a controlled male, an unexposed male, can fertilize about 85% of a female's eggs. That's reduced to about 15% in atrazine-exposed males. And that's in part because if you look at the testes, and I'm going to show you sections under the microscope, the testes of control males are filled with sperm, whereas the atrazine-treated males have reduced fertility and are completely, in most cases, devoid of sperm. So that's what I mean in part by demasculinization. In other cases, we also find that sometimes the sperm is replaced by eggs. So this is a frog's gonads that have yolked up eggs bursting through the surface of this exposed male's testes. What's more, effects are observed in humans. So this is not my work. This is work of a colleague showing that if you get pregnant during peak atrazine contamination, you're more likely to have babies with malformations. And those malformations include, and as this study showed, the inability of the male genitalia to develop in utero. So what this paper showed, I won't read all of it to you, is that babies exposed to atrazine in utero, if they're male, the sons are born often with hypospadias, where the urethra doesn't end all the way through the penis, cryptorchidism, where the testes don't descend into the scrotum, so the sac is empty, and a small penis, the penis doesn't grow. What's interesting is these features are consistent with the mechanism of atrazine in frogs, decreased testosterone and increased estrogen. From the start, the industry, which originally funded my research, launched attacks, including publicizing, quote, research that we have funded. The company, Syngenta, does not support the conclusions that Hayes is drawing from his own research. Those actions included, as shown here in this news article, hiring people to attack documentaries that I was involved in discussing my work. It include Syngenta, shown here by the news article, Syngenta investigating the press and shaping the news about atrazine. And it included the industry, the company, going around to universities where I was lecturing and trying to preload negative impressions of me and my work and generating a controversy that called my work into question. That all continued pretty heavily until New Yorker Magazine in 2014 published a pretty extensive article about Syngenta's organized attacks on me. At the time in 2014, as shown here, Ann Bryan, a senior manager for communications at Syngenta, said, "I am troubled by a suggestion that we have ever tried to discredit anyone. Our focus has always been on communicating the science and setting the record straight." So even though I pointed out that they were trying to discredit me, they completely denied that. And they continue with that denial until a lawsuit, as you can see here. They paid $105 million. I was not involved in the lawsuit as an expert witness directly. And the most significant thing for me in my work as a result of the lawsuit was that all of their notes from their secret meetings, Syngenta's meetings, including their notes about me, became public. So for example, these are all documents now that were filed and under seal. These are privileged and confidential documents that the lawyers obtained from Syngenta that included their plan to discredit me. As you can see, even though they denied it, they actually had a meeting where they wrote down that their main goal for science was to discredit Hayes. You can also see here from their notes that they had a strategy for, quote, education, a strategy for politics and legislation, a strategy for legal action as well. So they were quite organized. They made lists, things that they were going to do to me. You can see here, FOIAing raw data, trying to get journals to retract my work at the top, investigating my funding, investigating my wife. On one of the documents, they had plans to investigate, to exploit my father's illnesses. My father recently had a heart attack at the time. Investigate my school history, consider suing. One of my favorites here, set a trap. They actually had plans to set a trap for me, and somebody in a meeting wrote that down. These are more notes from Syngenta. If I wanted to win the day, they say they called me paranoid, schizophrenic, narcissistic. As you can see here from the line, they fancied that if I was involved in a scandal, that environmental groups will drop him. They plan to blog my psychology with claims that I suffered from mental health problems and that my work was not reliable. Blog my psychological profile, contact Berkeley. They tried to actually have me removed as a professor from Berkeley. And so the real question is, where was the EPA on this? At the time, I had a lot of faith in the Environmental Protection Agency, and I thought, well, certainly the EPA would be of help. And I shared all of my data with the EPA. That didn't come across. As you can see here, here's a quote from the EPA saying that they have never seen the results from any independent investigator published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. And this was a statement by Ann Lindsay. My computer's stuck here. Okay, here we go. But as you can see here, this is from a reporter in New York Times who 2 years prior had asked the EPA, but one thing I'm curious, she said, about is whether or not Tyrone did provide the data. And the EPA replied at that time, Tyrone did provide the EPA's data and standard operating procedures. He's been very cooperative with the agency. So that's conflicting with what the EPA was reporting, what Ann Lindsay of the EPA was reporting. It turns out, as you can see here from Syngenta's notes from 2003, they wrote, check if we sent Lindsay testimony, and they wrote, is Ann Lindsay prepared to speak to reporters? So clearly Syngenta was feeding false information to members of the EPA and getting them to speak on their behalf. Part of that is because they had people like Klaus Werner working on the EPA scientific panel at the same time that they were being paid to do research for Syngenta. And that's been a big part of the problem as well. So where's the EPA now? After 20 years, they said to the New Yorker magazine that a monetary value is applied to disease impairments and shorten lives and weighed against the benefits of keeping a chemical in use. So they're no longer denying now that their data to support that atrazine is damaging to environmental health and public health, but they're reporting that they take into account economic benefits. In 2020, again, after 20 years of I started my research, they finally reported, they released a draft biological evaluation for atrazine and two related compounds. And they concluded that atrazine is likely to adversely affect, this is a quote, 54% of all species and 40% of critical habitats. So after 20 years, 2020, they're reporting that atrazine likely adversely affects 54% of all species and 40% of critical habitats. So you might think that my research and my efforts have actually moved us along, but it turns out also in that same year, US EPA reapproved atrazine, even though they now have the data, and even though now they say that 54% of all species and 40% of habitats are impacted. So I just want to end here with who helped. I didn't always have the support that I needed from my university, but groups like CHE, Collaborative for Health and the Environment, and Pesticide Action Network, the Natural Resource Defense Council, a number of organizations really did help me in many ways, both in terms of protecting my funding, protecting my job, and other things that we can talk about. And also I have to give a shout out to Pete Myers, who really organized a group of scientists to stand by me and support me in my work and in my efforts to bring this information to the public. And I'll stop there and thank you very, very much for everyone for including me and allowing me to participate today. Rachel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayes. So I am now very glad to introduce Dr. David Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter is Professor of Environmental Health Sciences and Director of the Institute for Health and the Environment at the State University of New York at Albany. Dr. Carpenter's research is focused on the study of environmental causes of human disease, especially the chronic diseases of older age, such as cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, arthritis, thyroid disease, and neurodegenerative diseases. He has studied rates of hospitalization for these and other diseases in relation to living near hazardous waste sites, fossil fuel power plants, and other areas of contamination in New York. He has used results of these ecological studies to study specific populations highly exposed to polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs and persistent pesticides in Native American and Alaskan Native communities and residents of Anniston, Alabama, sites of the Monsanto plant that made PCBs. These studies have confirmed the association between PCB exposure and increased risk of hypertension and diabetes. He has ongoing collaborative studies on air pollution and health in several countries and studies health effects of electromagnetic field exposure. He has more than 450 peer-reviewed publications and has edited 6 books. I'd like to invite him now to speak about his recent experiences in maintaining the integrity of independent scientific research. Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Rachel. I've been studying health effects of PCBs for a long period of time, 30, 40 years. And of my almost 500 publications, probably 20% are studies of PCB effects, either on animal and cellular systems or in human systems. And because of my involvement in research and my directing a large program studying the health effects of PCBs, it was perhaps not so surprising that in about the year 2000, I was invited to be an expert witness in legal cases in Anniston, Alabama. Anniston being one of 2 sites where Monsanto manufactured PCBs. We won a number of those cases on behalf of individuals that simply lived near the plant. Most Black and minority people were never employed there, but they were exposed by the local environmental contamination. Since that time, I've been invited to be an expert witness on a whole variety of PCB cases, and more recently on Roundup cases, both manufactured by Monsanto, both carcinogens, both having a whole variety of other health effects. I started my career as a neuroscientist. Both PCBs and Roundups have effect on learning and memory and cognitive function. And so I really am a very good expert witness. Now, in addition to the fact that I have my own personal research to talk about, it's been my practice not to accept payment for expert witness work myself, but rather to use that to support my students and staff. And that, of course, appeals to juries because so many expert witnesses use that activity just to line their own pocket. Well, everything was going along quite well until a little over a year ago, my university got a FOIL request from Monsanto's lawyers, and they demanded everything I had on my long-term studies with the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne in northern New York, southern Ontario, and Quebec, individuals that live downstream from 3 aluminum foundry plants that use PCBs as hydraulic fluids that leaked, contaminated the St. Lawrence River and its tributaries, contaminated the fish, the air, the soil, the sediment. And so I provided documents, and after a number of months, that sort of went away. And then just about exactly a year and a couple of months ago, there came another FOIL request to the University at Albany, demanding every documentation I ever had in terms of my receipts for legal work. I provided them. And again, most of them showed that payments went to students and staff. But my university freaked out. Big bad Monsanto was saying boo, and the university just panicked. So I was put on, quotes, alternate assignment. And I was on alternate assignment for over 9 months. I was told I could not go to my office. Initially, I could not even talk to my 8 PhD students. That was rescinded fairly quickly because nobody else had the time or energy or resources to support 8 different PhD students. My federal grants, I had 2 federal grants, both for work in Alaska with Alaska Native populations. They were frozen. I couldn't access them. And I was stymied. I was ultimately allowed to email my students, have them visit me at my home, but I couldn't come to my office. Well, that went on forever, it seemed. I did have a local lawyer, and after 8 months or 9 months, we decided that it would be time to reach out to the press. And there was a reporter for the Albany Times-Union that I had worked with previously, Brendan Lyons. We had worked around the issues relating to the General Electric contamination of the Hudson River with PCBs. And we met with Brendan, and that resulted in a series of 4 different front page articles about how I'd been treated by the university. And suddenly, the environmental groups that I've worked with for over the years, I didn't realize I had so many friends in so many places. They mobilized and pressured the university, and more importantly, pressured the central administration of the SUNY system, of the 64 campuses of the SUNY system. The result of that was that in 1 week's time, there was a letter signed by over 2,000 people from almost every country in the world objecting to my treatment by the university. The SUNY central system were embarrassed by this and basically demanded that the University at Albany restore me to my circumstances. That has happened. So let me just summarize in some ways how I see now that a scientist can influence public policy. You know, I have, as I said, I have about 500 publications in peer-reviewed journals. I've edited books. I have a number of other publications. For the most part, they have never changed public policy. They're read by other scientists. Only in one occasion, when New York decided to ban hydrofracking in New York, they waived one of my publications where we showed significant air pollution in 5 other states for people that lived around fracking sites. So that maybe had a little influence, that publication, on public policy. I've testified before the US Congress, both the House and the Senate. I've testified in state agencies. I've testified before Attorney General in multiple states on environmental health issues. And I've not really seen that it had much effect. I have worked closely with environmental groups, and boy, have they been effective. They bang on the door, they make a lot of noise, and they get the attention of legislatures in a way that I, as a personal scientist, could not do that. But none of those actions really provide recompense to individuals that suffer. Both PCBs and Roundup cause cancer, especially non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Both alter cognitive function in children and in adults. And in the case of PCBs, there are all these other diseases that Rachel mentioned: hypertension, diabetes, endocrine disruption, all kinds of diseases in addition to cancer that pose elevated risk to people when they're exposed. Most people don't think of PCBs as risk factors for high blood pressure and for diabetes, but they are. So the litigation part, I don't apologize for at all. I feel that's part of my responsibility as a public health professional. And at least that, in some cases, does give some compensation to individuals that are harmed. So in summary, I've been attacked by Monsanto. It's not over yet. I was just recently given a subpoena to produce a number of documents for a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma case in Hawaii just a couple of weeks ago. So there's this pattern of harassment, of trying to hire people to make contrary claims, both in published literature and in the press, trying to make the point that results for harm are inconsistent and inconclusive, when if you look at reports by people that don't have conflicts of interest, they are neither inconclusive or inconsistent. Monsanto and many other companies have a habit and practice of trying to discredit people that present true and accurate information about the products that they make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carpenter. So, yeah, I just very much appreciate the work that all of you are doing, and thank you for talking about it with us today. So now I'm very pleased to introduce Stacy Malkan. Stacy Malkan is co-founder and managing editor of US Right to Know, a nonprofit investigative research group working globally to expose corporate wrongdoing and government failures that threaten our health, environment, and food system. She investigates and reports on pesticide and food industry public relations and lobbying operations. Ms. Malkan is author of the award-winning book, Not Just a Pretty Face, The Ugly Side of the Beauty Industry, and co-founder of the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics, which pressured companies to remove hazardous chemicals from personal care products. Thanks so much to Ms. Malkan for joining us today to share her important research. Ms. Malkan.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Che, and I'm really honored to be here today with Tyrone and David, two scientists who were under tremendous pressure and personal attacks for speaking the truth about science, and stood up to those and triumphed. So I'm so grateful to you both for sharing your stories, and I want to think with everyone today about how we can collectively work to bolster our support as a community for protecting independent science and scientists. The examples I'm going to talk about today, and let me share my slides here. Okay. The examples I'm going to talk about today come straight from internal corporate documents, and we have a huge trove of source material, and I want to take a moment to explain the genesis of this work. In 2015, I co-founded US Right to Know with Gary Ruskin, and he began filing eventually hundreds of public records requests at public universities and other publicly funded entities to investigate how the pesticide industry works with those groups on its product defense campaigns. And we report on many of these findings in the Merchants of Poison report, which I wrote with Kendra Klein from Friends of the Earth and Anna LePay. And many of the documents that we write about in the report and from the Roundup cancer trials are now posted at the UCSF Industry Documents Archive. We've also contributed to their Food Industry Documents Archive. So we'll post links for those also in the chat. I also want to give a shout out to the book Merchants of Doubt, which is how we named our report, the wonderful book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway that talks about fossil fuel industry disinformation campaigns. And many of the tactics are the same that the pesticide industry is using, that we see with big tobacco and also big oil. And I would argue that in some ways they're more effective because the pesticide industry has, in many cases, the backing of mainstream academic institutions. So here's what the key findings of our report. We have a whole chapter about how they work with academia, and I'm not going to get into that. I'll focus today on the attacks on science. But I want to say that we focus on glyphosate in this report because it's the world's most widely used herbicide. As David said, it's a lot of evidence tying it to human cancer. And in 2015, the World Health Organization's Independent Agency for Research on Cancer designated glyphosate a probable human carcinogen, which unleashed a huge public relations pushback campaign, which I'll talk about today. And also, since then, over 100,000 people are suing Monsanto with claims that exposure to glyphosate-based Roundup caused their cancers, and specifically non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So though all those documents as well went into this analysis that we came out with, we really wanted to focus on what are the tactics that the industry is using, and we came up with these 5. So I'll talk about the attacks on scientists today and some of how they do that. But I want to mention first that there are many, many ways, and this that came out in the documents about how the companies manipulate the scientific record in the first place. So lots of different strategies. And this has been well covered with some of these headlines. You can see mainstream media. It's been written about in academic journals. There was a congressional investigation, several books now, including 2 by my colleague, my former colleague, Carrie Gillum. And so it's well established, but what we felt like we could contribute on top of all this with the Merchants of Poison report was to comb through the documents and see what they could tell us about the playbook, about how Monsanto and the other pesticide companies and the food industry, which is often a partner with them, run their product defense campaigns. So a key piece of the attacks on science were a full-on attack on the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And so this is the WHO's Cancer Research Agency of independent scientists and world-renowned cancer researchers who conduct and coordinate research on the causes of cancer, and they look at cancer hazards. So here are just a couple of descriptions about the sort of level of attacks. An article in the American Journal of Public Health by the Dean of the Colorado School of Public Health. He described it as an unprecedented and harsh strategy that parallels those used by the tobacco industry and others, but was notable for its intensity, its reach, and its impact. And he said that Monsanto's attack on IARC really amounted to an attack on the expert review process itself. And journalists at Le Monde, France's largest paper, and they won an award for their dozen stories on the Monsanto papers, they described it as an effort to destroy the UN Cancer Agency by any means possible. So it was very robust and bold. You can see from Monsanto's documents that they were planning, even before the IARC report came out, they had a very robust preparedness and engagement plan to deal with the carcinogen rating. It describes their messaging. They talked about wanting to create outrage about IARC. You can see in the documents, they thought it would be a 2B classification, which is possibly carcinogenic. It came out as 2A, so that only ratcheted up the intensity of their fury. They planned to orchestrate outcry, to work with front groups to do this. They would describe the science coming from IARC as an agenda-driven hypothesis versus their science-based studies. So this document, I think this is one of the key parts here where they talk about their plans to engage industry partners. And you can see there they have 4 tiers of groups that they plan to deploy. Not much text there, but those groups representing huge, well-funded, tons of money, tons of reach. In the first tier, we have the trade associations, groups that are known in the public to be directly funded by industry to do product defense. Tier 2, your front groups, science-y sounding groups that in many cases claim to be independent, but were working directly with companies. And those were the groups that really unleashed the most aggressive and prolific attacks on both IARC and individual scientists. Tier 3 represents a huge swath of power, the entire processed food industry, which would be activated by a stakeholder engagement team involving 2 high-budget spin groups, the International Food Information Council and Center for Food Integrity, and the Grocery Manufacturers Association. And the role of those groups would be to inoculate the food industry with Monsanto's talking points about low levels of glyphosate and the agenda-driven hypothesis of IARC. And then tier 4, the Key Growers Association. These are farmers groups representing corn, soy growers with budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So a lot of firepower. We analyzed the budgets of these groups that were named directly in Monsanto's glyphosate defense document. So it was this document and 2 others. And we came up with this, we have this in the report, the budgets amounting to $1.4 billion over 5 years. not just on glyphosate defense, but much of that is spent on product defense in general and the strategies that we talk about in the report. And for the front groups, it's easily tens of millions of dollars a year in groups that are deployed specifically to message on chemicals are safe and we don't need to worry. So I'm going to talk about kind of a backdoor strategy and a front door strategy that were key to Monsanto's attacks on IARC. And the backdoor strategy, I'm going to focus on a couple of the front groups. And they really were the most aggressive attack dogs, as I said. And some of you will be familiar with these groups, the American Council on Science and Health. That group has been claiming to debunk junk science since 1978. And they've claimed many times to be independent of companies, but their own documents show very close ties to companies, and also really that they work with companies on quid pro quo deals. Like we'll do a report on vinyl chloride if we get funding from the vinyl industry and so forth. The Monsanto documents are very clear, this group asking Monsanto for money. And you can see here in the documents, there's a Monsanto scientist who is arguing with his colleagues at Monsanto that they really need to work with this group, even though they're problematic, they have plenty of warts, but bottom line, you will not get a better value for your dollar than funding the American Council on Science and Health. And it goes on to discuss how they're working with us to respond if needed to IARC. And then he talks about the prolific output of this group, 2 books and a pamphlet that are extremely useful. Those caps are in the original documents, and a pesticide review, and 53 recent examples of postings. And this is only a partial list. So these groups just keep producing output. That's a key part of their strategy and their power. They just constantly putting out attacks on scientists, on journalists, on public interest groups. They've written many attacks about my groups, about us personally. That's really their role. Another group tied to them, the Genetic Literacy Project. This was founded by John Entine, who had a PR firm that had Monsanto as a client when he launched Genetic Literacy Project. Way back, he wrote in 2011, Chemophobia, Threats to Public Health. And this was a book defending atrazine, probably in response to some of Tyrone's work. And it was published by American Council on Science and Health, who was funded by Syngenta, and who you can see in the documents was asking Syngenta for an extra $100,000 for a project that sounded a lot like this book. John claims that he had no idea that Syngenta was funding ASHI. So if you search on their website for IARC, you'll find 200 articles, and most of them, many of them, attacks on the scientists themselves. Here's some examples of the personal attacks that they ran against scientists, describing the agency as corrupt, distortion, fraud, activist scientists who are in it for personal profit and ideological vanity. And these are volunteer scientists, by the way, who spend a tremendous amount of their own time on the IARC panels. They accuse the director of lying to Congress, the panel of selectively excluding science from the review, corruption, secrecy, etc. Some of these were written by, as you can see, other front groups or former lobbyists or climate science denialists. And their funders, maybe not surprisingly, they really are sneaky about their funders, but they finally did in 2020 start to disclose Bayer is a major funder, Donors Trust, the Koch brothers' secret money vehicle, and also the Skay Foundation, Searle Freedom Trust, and Templeton Foundation. And these are some of the key funders, according to research by Robert Brule at Drexel, has looked at the climate science denial network and found it's not just the Koch brothers, it's a group of conservative foundations that are arguing for deregulation across the economy. So they're big funders of Genetic Literacy Project. Now, despite all this, and it's really smarmy stuff, but they are also very prolific and constantly publishing things. And they are also often rising to the top of a Google News search for any topic of importance to the pesticide industry on any given day. So I think this is really important for the environmental health community to know and to kind of look out for. This was a search that I did on pesticides in food, and you see that it's not just the first, not just the second. The top 5 hits are all from Genetic Literacy Project. And we've done this search on many search terms across years, and it's often the same, especially if it's a politically important time for industry. You'll see many of the top 10 hits coming from genetic literacy projects, sometimes American Council on Science and Health, or Science 2.0, or other science websites that are connected to them. So they have huge reach. Not only that, but they also enjoy, unfortunately, some legitimacy is given to them from top universities like the University of California, Davis, and University of Florida, where they were running 3-day boot camps, training scientists and journalists on basically the talking points of the pesticide industry, supporting glyphosate and GMOs, discrediting any science that is opposed to those points. And then also there's some documents about a US government genetic literacy project, along with Jay Byrne, who was Monsanto's former comms director. So I point this out to say these groups are really getting a lot of legitimacy through entities like Google News, mainstream universities, and the US government. And I think we need to challenge that as a community. So that's a backdoor strategy. I want to talk for a minute about a front door strategy, which was involved working with the mainstream media. So this was a series of reports that came out in Reuters in 2016 and 17, really gunning for the International Agency for Research on Cancer by a reporter named Kate Kelland. And so you can see here, there's an overview story about how IARC is confusing consumers. They say bacon's bad for you, and then accusing them of a series of wrongdoing. Leaving out science, withholding information. The industry is calling for reform, and US lawmakers backing them up and trying to defund IARC. So this was all part of a very effective campaign that caused policymakers to suggest, and many of them in the GOP, to suggest defunding IARC. So it led to a huge fight. And there were issues with these stories right off the bat. My colleague, Carrie Gillum, who also was at Reuters for many years, really looked closely at them, and several of us did. And you can see in these stories things like, several of them are exclusive scoops. They use sources that didn't disclose industry ties, anonymous sources, no links to source materials, those sorts of things that were raising concerns. And then later, the documents came out showing exactly how Monsanto and its PR firms had worked with Kate Kelland in the background, sort of over a long period of time. And you see a PR firm saying they engaged her, and thanks to us, her first piece was critical. Now they're going to go look for an anonymous source for her to use in their stories. She was sending confidential drafts to Monsanto. So a cozy relationship was developing as she was continuing to write about IARC. And then the big hit was directed at Dr. Aaron Blair, who was a National Cancer Institute epidemiologist and the chair of the IARC working group. And you can see Monsanto's public relations director, Sam Murphy, sending Kate an exclusive, including his testimony from the trials, which had not been made public, and very well laid out points that he wanted to make her to make in her story, including in a slide deck. I mean, it was just like, the huge headlines, the bullet points. Here's the story. We're handing it to you with exclusive materials, and please don't say you got them from us. All of which Kate Kelland did, and wrote this story, Cancer Agency Left in the Dark Over Glyphosate Evidence, which did not link to the original testimony, which did contradict actually the key points in the story. And several journalists, scientists pointed that out. IARC itself put out a statement refuting these claims. And Reuters did refuse to correct or retract. They did add some information about disclosures of people connected who had industry links that weren't disclosed in the original story. And nevertheless, it went worldwide. It was picked up by media outlets around the world. The industry ran ads with it. It also was the basis of several congressional attacks and letters from congressmen who used this as their main source for calling for defunding IARC. So what one journalist can do is pretty amazing and disturbing, but that's what happened. And I think it's important to know that this stuff goes on and how important it is to engage with reporters in a very close way. Just yesterday, I did a search for Aaron Blair and glyphosate, and it still comes up #1, along with the #3 hit for his name from the American Council on Science and Health. So these are some of the ways that Monsanto attacks are infiltrating through, coming at us from front groups and sometimes from mainstream media, and with the support of other major entities across the food industry, in government, and in universities. And so we write about these details in Merchants of Poison. We have over 500 footnotes in that report. So as I said, tons of source material to see how they do it. And I do believe that shining light on this, bringing transparency to the strategies, to the rather desperate tactics, is really important for using to inform the public and policymakers about what's going on. I want to end on a good note, because and I want to acknowledge to any scientists listening, this isn't, of course, intimidating. I mean, they are going all out, and I think these attacks are getting worse as the science catches up with these companies. And it's hard to do good science in this environment, and it's important to be on solid footing, have the support of the wider community, and bring transparency to the efforts to silence scientists. And even with all this, science triumphs and good, brave scientists triumph. And I want to say congratulations to Tyrone. I just love this. Recently elected to the National Academy of Sciences. That is wonderful news. And I'm going to quote from a Facebook post by Pete Myers, who I saw was on this call, and I hope this is okay, Pete, but it was a public post, so I'm going to assume it was okay. And he was sharing the news about Tyrone being elected to the NAS, and he says, "Here is evidence that the arc of history may sometimes bend toward justice. It's a big FU to Syngenta that needs to be celebrated, because they engaged in all sorts of nasty manipulations to undermine Dr. Hayes' reputation and cast doubt on his scientific contributions. Syngenta, you lose with this big time." And a bunch of resources that we will also drop in the chat to the documents that are in the UCSF library. And we just also had a post about 6 ways to confront pesticide industry disinformation, which shares some ideas about response.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Stacy and David. It's truly my honor to share the stage with my brother and sister in arms. A lot of the same names keep coming up, don't they?
It is Rachel, a lot of the same people.
Rachel, I saw in the chat that you have an introduction to someone who has something to share before we go into question Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much. We're going to ask Vi Wagi to just speak very briefly. Vi, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So we're going to, yeah, okay. I think, Vi, are you able to speak now?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I would just like to take this opportunity. My name is Bangunhak, daughter of the late John Andela Wakai. I am a Sibukak Yipik grandmother. And I would just like to give a perspective from a community whose health and well-being has been harmed due to legacy military toxics, and because of where we live in the Arctic. We are some of the most highly contaminated people on the planet. And my community, native village of Savunga and native village of Gamble, we are very grateful to partner with Dr. Carpenter. After we had exhausted all efforts, former health aide Annie Aloha approached our executive director. I'm a environmental health program director with Alaska Community Action on Toxics. I'm also a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, appointed by Biden and Harris administration. I would just like to thank Dr. Carpenter. Our partnership with him has validated my community's knowledge and our concerns due to all the health harms we're seeing in our people associated with two Cold War era formerly used defense sites. We are very grateful. We have to stand behind our scientists. And what I've come to learn about the practices of what we see in this nation are so unethical, and these multinational corporations are driven by greed and profit. However, communities like mine, if it wasn't for specifically for Dr. Carpenter, we would not be where we are. We have had our own community-based project since 2000. That says a lot in itself, to hold the military accountable. And we have been called alarmists. We have had controversy with the PCB levels in the blood of my people. However, we have to stand behind our scientists, because our own knowledge and our own wisdom and are still being discredited by Western culture. So I just wanted to share that very briefly. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm Dr. Carpenter, you know, as a family of 8 and have in my immediate family who has had cancer, we associate, including low birth weight babies, miscarriages, on and on, the diabetes, endocrine systems, health harms that you heard Dr. Carpenter share. We attribute that to the military toxics, to POPs, sequestered POPs, the research we have been doing by ourselves on the island. And I want to stand behind Dr. Carpenter on behalf of my community, but other communities throughout the nation and globe whose own observation and knowledge are still being discredited, and it affects our dignity and our as first people of these lands. We are intricately tied to our lands and waters, and we are very much educated in our indigenous people's knowledge of our lands and waters, but also our health harms we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, Tyrone.
Yes, thank you
Back
very
to
much,
you.
Vi. There's lots of comments coming in the chat in response to your words. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing. I'm seeing in the Q&A, there's a question about finances and support of scientists under fire. I know in particular, once my work became controversial, the National Science Foundation didn't pull my funding, but they certainly stopped funding me at the same level. And groups like RISLA Foundation and Ceres Foundation and Beyond Pesticides and Alton Jones were incredibly helpful to me in keeping my lab floating and keeping the work going. And I'm grateful, and I'm sure I'm leaving out somebody, and I don't mean to do so, but those groups were incredibly important to me to help. And also I had the support of Steve Tillery, a lawyer, for some of my legal concerns, which never materialized because I think he scared them all off. Specifically, David, there's some questions about your legal fees and how you got them paid for and how much they were. And if you have similar things you can share, Stacy, I think we'd all be happy to hear it.
Well, my legal fees actually, I've not been charged for a lot of the time, enormous amount of time, that my local lawyer has devoted to defending me. And I think that, I must say my interaction with the legal profession, they're the good guys and they're the bad guys, but the good guys are really good. My first involvement in litigation was with a former senator in Alabama who defended poor people that had no money against Monsanto. Now, Monsanto, of course, had hired lawyers and making piles of money, but the legal profession is not all bad, and some of it is extraordinarily good. So I've been very fortunate by support from not just community people, but also my legal staff. I've not been so fortunate with support by my university, which, Tyrone, sounds like at the beginning you had the same experience there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Stacy, did you have?
our funding, we are funded by foundations and private individuals. We don't take corporate funders. We have a lot of small donor funders, and we disclose all our funding on our website at usrtk.org in the About Us page. So we have all our donors and the amounts listed there.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to sort of combine several questions here, which seem to be asking about how we get our message out to the public, how we, one of the questions said that if the public had faith in our food system, then we'd never be tricked in this way anyway. So I guess the question is about how do we get the information out to the public in a way that that helps people who are not scientists, who are not directly involved, figure out what is the truth and what's not the truth, especially when some of these industry individuals are spinning the truth or providing mis or disinformation. Any suggestions, especially in dealing with social media?
One thing I want to share is that we do have a series of fact sheets that we've written about front groups, also university affiliated people and others that are working directly with industry. So we share what the documents show about that, some of the ways in which these groups operate. And we really do that to just try to get the facts into people's hands so people can use those, to bolster your own communications. And I'm going to put that in the chat. I'm not sure if my comments are showing up in the chat, Kristen and Rachel. It says it's going to just hosts and panelists, but I'll put them there. And if everyone can't see them, maybe you can repost them.
I can see. I think they're showing up.
Great. Okay. I think it's incredibly important for all of us to just do whatever we can in a bolder, stronger, louder way, what groups have always been doing, but it's such an intense time. And I think the truth really does win out. People are looking for true and accurate information about the health impacts of chemicals. And they know, because we all know people with cancer and young people with infertility. And I just think there's a real hunger for understanding the facts. We also have a series of fact sheets documenting science on some of the key chemicals of concern. And those are getting a lot of hits, and they're very popular. And we keep them updated continually with science from the top journals showing health impacts.
It is difficult because the chemicals are contaminating so many things that you can't basically eat without taking some of these things in. For example, there's a report that the biggest source of glyphosate for most people is pasta. And whoever thought about pasta being contaminated? But, Roundup is sprayed on almost all food crops. It gets in our food. The thing about PCBs, even though they haven't been manufactured in this country since the late 70s, we've made a practice of recycling waste animal fats into food that's fed back to animals that we eat. So you have a cow that was eating PCBs back in 1977, that fat gets fed to subsequent generations of cows. So now even today, you can't eat a slab of butter, eat an egg, have a Big Mac, you have a piece of chicken without having some of these chemicals in the food. So it's a difficult message to convey to people that there's almost no way to avoid some contamination. Now, clearly, the place where we should have action is at the level of federal regulation. And there we get caught up in the same thing that we've been talking about today, the power of the industries to influence the political activities by regulatory agencies, not just EPA, even HHS and all of the other agencies. There's a sense you don't want to scare people, but people sometimes should be scared in order to mobilize them to take actions that will preserve their health.
I think one of the other concerns is, I think back to the COVID situation where people were watching science unfold in real time, and people in some cases had trouble. Do I believe this? Do I believe that? And oftentimes I had through social media people saying, well, this person's also a doctor. This person also has a PhD. And how do we, and I know that I don't have the answer to this, I have trouble. How do we help people differentiate between, for example, not everything is a industry conspiracy, right? So for example, there were lots of questions about the vaccine and the safety of the vaccine. And how do we help people weed and get through and make those kinds of decisions?
I don't have the answer for that either. I think it's a critical question.
Okay, there's sorry, Stacy.
I just want to say it is super overwhelming. It really is. But I have a lot of hope. I think what people are doing, moms are finding, for example, connection with others who have figured this out, finding communities of connection through environmental groups, through social media networks. We absolutely have to, of course, vet and be aware of all these strategies and really take a close look at sources. And always have a radar up about that more than we even think we do. I think, these strategies of disinformation are so overwhelming, coming at us from so many ways. I think we don't hear enough about corporate disinformation in the public discussion about disinformation. So I want to keep shining the light there, and tell people, we just have to trust ourselves and really know our sources and share what information we have. And if you have good sources and good trusted groups, share them with your friends and help people get connected to these networks of trust.
Thank you. We're getting another question. It's specifically, what do the presenters think can be done to protect against industry influence at the EPA? Because I brought up the influence with the EPA, but under the Obama administration, a Monsanto vice president was put in charge of the FDA. And I happen to know that there were individuals involved in the National Science Foundation in my case. So the question is, what possibly can we do? Is there a mechanism to try to prevent the infiltration?
Well, I think the EPA is a particular problem because it's a regulatory agency. And almost any government agency has as its responsibility to balance risk versus benefit. So EPA is not only a health agency. And, it does have to balance risk versus benefit. But I think lots of times people don't understand that. And, I beat up on the EPA all the time because I think they're not setting standards that are truly health protective. But it's understandable. And one has to understand that the political infrastructure, who's in the White House has an enormous amount to deal with what the EPA does. Also what HHS does, what the FDA does, what the FCC does. And those are decisions all made by political influence as well as industry influence and health expertise influence. What we have to do is increase the credibility and the loudness and the emphasis on the health effects that are not distorted by political or conflict of interest concerns.
I also want to add to that it's definitely, unfortunately, corporate corruption and capture at EPA is bipartisan problem. I mean, Monsanto for 40 years through 8 administrations was getting the EPA to back them up. And to another quote from Pete Myers, I think is important. The science that EPA uses is in the Jurassic era. It's so outdated. There was a recent study looking at this was in Europe, but the studies that came from companies that regulatory agencies depended on for the glyphosate review, and out of 53 of them, like only 2 of them had modern standards of science, and none of them included the most sensitive test for cancer. So, but yet the agency is being used by the company as the be all end all. EPA says it's okay, therefore it's okay. EPA did retract its glyphosate authorization and is back at the drawing board with that. But as David said, yeah, pointing that out and being vocal about it, shining light on it, and really demanding better from both parties.
And I think it's much more dangerous when we talk about the EPA in the sense that I testified in Australia and in India and in Africa regarding atrazine, and there wasn't an independent assessment. They simply cited what the EPA said. They simply said, well, if the EPA is not going to ban it, we're not going to ban it. And so there was no traction whatsoever in having discussions in the case of Australia, where there was clear harm to the environment and to individuals. As a matter of reference, for example, in Australia, because atrazine is a herbicide, it's actually used in Australia in swimming pools to prevent algae from growing. So you literally have little kids swimming in atrazine in southern Australia. But there was no independent assessment. It was all based on this testimony by Ann Lindsay, which, as you saw, Syngenta had control over. So the EPA has a global impact in that regard. We're getting questions. I'm sort of combining 2 or 3 questions again about what can the average person do to not only promote the science and to let the EPA know that they want better science, but also to support us as scientists who are in the trenches.
Well, I think the public can influence EPA through their elected representatives. And that's perhaps the most effective way. Now, there are a lot of very good people at EPA that understand that the official positions of the agency are usually not as health protective as they should be. But they are limited. The top people in EPA are limited because they report to higher levels in the political establishment. So I think direct appeal to EPA is appropriate, but perhaps more effectively is using our senators, our congressmen, and people that can actually control the funding that goes to the agencies.
I want to speak to something also that young people can do, or young and old, or anyone at a university campus. We have a wonderful toolkit that students can use to try to uncover corporate funding at universities. Often that's not disclosed. It's often going through university foundations that don't disclose their funding. But there's a lot you can do about that to demand transparency on campuses. And I think that's super important to put together how much money from big ag is going through, especially land grant universities, and how influential that is. So as I said, we have a chapter on that in Merchants of Poison, but here's our toolkit. I just put it in the chat with specific tips about how students can use freedom of information laws to get at what's happening on their campus with corporate influence.
And I think it would also be important to mention, although it sometimes isn't considered as a specific environmental health issue, but the whole of the looming danger of climate change and how badly that's threatening the whole life on Earth, and the incredible influence that the oil and gas industry has on public policies related to combustion of fossil fuels that promote climate change. This is clearly the major daunting task we have to totally change the way that we provide and use energy.
That's huge. And also, you know, I think the new front of the pesticide industry is they're the solution to climate. You know, their public relations campaigns are double down on industrial agriculture is going to be the solution to climate change. Turn corn and soy commodity crops into ultra processed foods with fake meat. It's just more of the same. And I really am hopeful for finding ways that for the climate and pesticide and public health movements to work together, because it's the same strategies, some of the same groups, the same people, the same funding streams that are really in desperate defense mode to try to convince us all that these business models need to continue exactly as they are. And I also want to give a shout out to I see something in the chat from a local Albany activist and all those who worked on supporting David Carpenter in Albany and the public health community. You all are amazing. And it's such a positive example of how community support really matters to support scientists and really specifically helped do something very important. So thank you all. And thank you, David, for sharing that story. I think it's a great role modeling of like, hey, this happened. I live to tell the tale. Both of you. I mean, this is really important. And I just honor you both so much for being willing to do that.
I'm so grateful for all of the people that supported me. If I hadn't had that, I would probably still be talking to you from my office at home.
You have a beautiful office there. We appreciate seeing it.
Well, thank you both. I see that we're approaching the close and we didn't get to all the questions, and I've tried my very best to sort of combine questions so that we can get as much in as possible. I don't know if there are closing remarks, or Rachel, did I turn it back over to you? And thank you all again for this opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, Dr. Hayes, Dr. Carpenter, Ms. Malkan, thank you just for your decades of really, really important work and for taking the time to talk with us today. And echoing what Ms. Malkan said, thank you so much to everybody who has stepped up to support independent scientists. And thanks to everybody who's out there working to support other people as we speak. It's such an important thing to do. So I'll just wrap up with some quick announcements. There is going to be a video recording of this discussion, and within a couple of days we'll have that on the CHE website, so you can find it at healthandenvironment.org, and you will also all get an email with the link to that recording. And then we'd like to invite you to join us for our upcoming webinars. So I'll just tell you about the one that's coming up next week. Next week on May 31st at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, the next CHE Alaska Partnership webinar will focus on metabolic effects of PFAS exposure. Dr. Jesse Goodrich will discuss a recent study, metabolic signatures of youth exposure to mixtures of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, a multi-cohort study. This is the first study to comprehensively examine effects of exposures to PFAS mixtures on human metabolisms. And we'll put that link into the chat. So with that, I'd like to again thank each of you so much for being with us today. Thanks to everyone in the audience for all of your comments and questions and for all the work that all of you are doing. As a reminder, most of the links that we put into the chat are also available on the webinar webpage, so you can find them there. And big thanks to CHE Director Kristen Schaefer, who has been helping to make all of this happen behind the scenes. And finally, thanks again to our partners at the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment's Science Action Network. So until next time, thanks again.